Memories, Dreams, Reflections by C.G. Jung, read aloud, Chapter 8, The Tower. Gradually, through my scientific work, I was able to put my fantasies and the contents of the unconscious on a solid footing. Words and paper, however, did not seem real enough to me. Something more was needed. I had to achieve a kind of representation in stone of my innermost thoughts, and of the knowledge I had acquired. Or, to put it another way, I had to make a confession of faith in stone. This was the beginning of the Tower, the house which I built for myself at Bollingen. It was settled from the start that I would build near the water. I had always been curiously drawn by the scenic charm of the upper lake of Zurich, and so in 1922 I bought some land in Bollingen. It was situated in the area of St. Meinrad, and is old church land, having formerly belonged to the monastery of St. Gall. At first I did not plan a proper house, but merely a kind of primitive one-story building. It was to be a round structure with a hearth in the center and bunks along the walls. I more or less had in mind an African hut with a fire ringed by a few stones, burns in the middle, and the whole life of the family revolves round this center. Primitive huts concretized an idea of wholeness, a familiar wholeness in which all sorts of small domestic animals likewise participate. But I altered the plan even during the first stages of building, for I felt it was too primitive. I realized it would have to be a regular two-story house, not a mere hut crouched in the ground. So in 1923 the first round house was built, and when it was finished I saw that it had become a suitable dwelling tower. The feeling of repose and renewal that I had in this tower was intense from the start. It represented for me the maternal hearth, but I became increasingly aware that it did not yet express something that needed saying, that something that was still lacking, and so 4 years later, in 1927, the central structure was added with a tower-like annex. After some time had passed, again the interval was 4 years, I once more had a feeling of incompleteness. The building seemed too primitive to me, and so, in 1931, the tower-like annex was extended. I wanted a room in this tower where I could exist for myself alone. I had in mind what I had seen in Indian houses, in which there is usually an area, though it may be only a corner of a room separated off by a curtain, to which the inhabitants can withdraw. There they can meditate for perhaps a quarter of an hour or so, or do yoga exercises. Such an area of retirement is essential in India, where people live crowded very close together. In my retiring room I am by myself. I keep the key with me all the time, and no one else is allowed in there except with my permission. In the course of the years I have done paintings on the walls, and so have expressed all those things which have carried me out of time into seclusion, out of the present into the timelessness. Thus the second tower became for me a place of spiritual concentration. In 1935 a desire arose in me for a piece of fenced-in land. I needed a large I needed a large space that would stand open to the sky and to nature, and so, once again, after an interval of 4 years, I added a courtyard and a loggia by the lake, which formed a fourth element, which was separated from the unitary threeness of the house. Thus a quartinity had arisen, 4 different parts of the building, and moreover in the course of 12 years. After my wife's death in 1955, I felt an inner obligation to become what I myself am. To put it in the language of the Bollingen house, I suddenly realized that the small central section, which crouched so low, so hidden, was myself. I could no longer hide myself between the maternal and the spiritual towers. So in the same year I added an upper story to this section, which represents myself from my ego personality. Earlier, I would not have been able to do this. I would have regarded it as a presumptuous self-emphasis. Now it signified an extension of the consciousness achieved in old age. With that, the building was complete. I had started the first tower in 1923, 2 months after the death of my mother. These 2 dates are meaningful because the tower, as we shall see, is connected with the dead. From the beginning, I felt the tower was in some way a place of maturation, a maternal womb or a maternal figure, in which I would become what I was, what I am, and will be. It gave me a feeling as if I were being reborn in stone. It is thus a concretization of the individuation process, a memorial are perennius. During the building work, of course, I never considered these matters. I built the house in sections, always following the concrete needs of the moment. It might also be said that I built it in a kind of dream. Only afterwards did I see how all the parts fitted together, and that a meaningful form had resulted, a symbol of psychic wholeness. At Bollingen, I am in the midst of my true life. I am most deeply myself. Here I am, as it were, the age-old son of the mother. Unquote. This is how alchemy puts it very wisely, for the old man and the ancient, unquote, whom I had already experienced as a child, is personality number 2, who has always been and always will be. He exists outside of time and is the son of the maternal unconscious. In my fantasies, he took the form of Philemon, and he comes to live life again at Bollingen. At times I feel as if I am spread out over the landscape and inside things, and am myself living in every tree, in the plashings of the waves, in the clouds, in the animals that come and go, in the procession of the seasons. There is nothing in the tower that has not grown into its own form over the decades, nothing which with which I am not linked. Here everything has its history, and mine. Here is space for the spaceless kingdom of the worlds and the Psyche's hinterland. I have done without electricity, and tend the fireplace and stove myself. Evenings I light old lamps. There is no running water, and I pump the water from a well. I chop the wood and cook the food. These simple acts make man simple, and how difficult it is to be simple. In Bollingen, silence surrounds me almost audibly, and I live in modest harmony with nature, quote unquote. Um, Footnote, title of an old Chinese woodcut showing an little old man in a heroic landscape. End of footnote. Thoughts arise to the surface which reach back into the centuries and accordingly anticipate our remote future. Here the torrent of creation is lessened, creativity and play are close together. In 1950, I made a kind of monument out of stone to express what the tower means to me. The story of how this stone came to me is a curious one. I needed stones for building the enclosing wall of the so-called garden, and ordered them from the quarry near Bollingen. I was standing by when the mason gave all the measurements to the owners of the quarry, who wrote them down in his notebook. When the stones arrived by ship and were unloaded, it turned out that the cornerstone had altogether the wrong measurements. Instead of a triangular stone, a square block had been sent, a perfect cube of much larger dimensions that had been ordered, about 20 inches thick. The mason was furious and told the bargeman to take it right back with them. But when I saw the stone, I said, "No, this is my stone. I must have it." For I had seen at once that it suited me perfectly, and that I wanted to do something with it. Only I did not yet know what. The first thing that occurred to me was a Latin verse by the alchemist Arnaldus de Villanova, died in 1313. I chiseled this into the stone. In translation it goes, "Here stands the mean, uncomely stone. 'Tis very cheap in price. The more it is despised by fools, the more loved by the wise." This verse refers to the alchemist's stone, the lapis, which is despised and rejected. Soon something else emerged. I began to see on the front face, in the natural structure of the stone, a small circle, a sort of eye, which looked at me. I chiseled it into the stone, and in the center made a tiny homunculus. This corresponds to the little doll, pupilla, yourself, which you see in the pupil of another's eye, a kind of Kabir, or the telephorus of Asclepius. Ancient statues show him wearing a hooded cloak and carrying a lantern. At the same time he is a pointer of the way. I dedicated a few words to him which came into my mind when I was working. The inscription is in Greek, and the translation goes, "Time is a child, playing like a child, playing a board game, the kingdom of the child. This is Telephoros, who roams through the dark regions of this cosmos and glows like a star out of the depths. He points the way to the gates of the sun and to the land of dreams." Footnote. The first sentence is a fragment from Heraclitus, The second sentence alludes to the Mithras liturgy, and the last sentence to Homer, Odysseus, Book 24, verse 12. End of footnote. These words came to me, one after the other, while I worked on the stone. On the third face, the one facing the lake, I let the stone itself speak, as it were, in a Latin inscription. These sayings are more or less quotations from alchemy. This is the translation. I am an orphan, alone. Nevertheless, I am found everywhere. I am one, but opposite to myself. I am youth and old man, at one and the same time. I have known neither father nor mother, because I have had to be fetched out of the deep like a fish, or fell like a white snow from the heaven. In woods and mountains I roam, but I am hidden in the innermost soul of man. I am mortal for everyone, and yet I am not touched by the cycle of the moon. In conclusion, under the saying of Arnaldius de Villanova, I set down in Latin the words, "In remembrance of his 75th birthday, C. G. Young made and placed this here as a thanks offering in the year 1950. When the stone was finished, I looked at it again and again, wondering about it and asking myself what lay behind my impulse to carve it. The stone stands outside the tower and is like an explanation of it. It is a manifestation of the occupant, but one which remains incomprehensible to others. Do you know what I wanted to chisel on the back face of the stone? Le cri de Merlin! For what the stone expressed reminded me of Merlin's life in the forest after he had vanished from the world. Men still hear his cries, so the legend runs, but they cannot understand or interpret them. Merlin represents an attempt by the medieval unconscious to create a parallel figure to Parsifal. Parsifal is a Christian hero, and Merlin, son of the devil and a pure virgin, is his dark brother. In the 12th century, when the legend arose, there were as yet no premise by which his intrinsic meaning could be understood. Hence he ended in exile, and therefore Le Cri de Merlin, which still sounded from the forest after his death. This cry that no one could understand implies that he lives on in unredeemed form. His story is not yet finished, and he still walks abroad. It might be said that the secret of Merlin was carried on by alchemy, primarily in the figure of Mercurius. Then Merlin was taken up again in my psychology of the unconscious, and remains uncomprehended to this day. That is because most people find it quite beyond them to live on close terms with the unconscious. Again and again, I have had to learn how hard this is for people. I was in Bollingen just as the first tower was being finished. That was the winter of 1923 to 1924. As far as I can recall, there was no snow on the ground, and perhaps it was early spring. I had been alone for perhaps a week, perhaps longer. An indescribable stillness prevailed. One evening, I can still remember it precisely, I was sitting by the fireplace and had put a big kettle on the fire to make hot water for washing up. The water began to boil and the kettle to sing, and it sounded like many voices or stringed instruments, or even like a whole orchestra. It was just the polyphonic music, which in reality I cannot abide, although in this case it seemed to me particularly interesting. It was as though there were one orchestra inside the tower and another one outside. Now one dominated, now the other, as though they were responding to each other. I sat and listened, fascinated. For more than an hour I listened to the concert to this natural melody. It was soft music containing as well all the discords of nature. And that was right, for nature is not only harmonious, she is also dreadfully contradictory and chaotic. The music was that way too, an outpouring of sounds having the quality of water and of wind, so strange that it is simply impossible to describe it. Another such still night, when I was alone in Bollingen, It was in the late winter or the summer of 1924. I awoke to the sound of soft footsteps going around the tower, distant music sounds coming closer and closer, and then I heard voices laughing and talking, and I thought, who can be prowling around? What is this all about? There is only the little footpath along the lake, and scarcely anybody ever walks on it. While I was thinking these things, I became wide awake and went to the window. I opened the shutters. All was still. There was no one in sight. Nothing to be heard. No wind. Nothing. Nothing at all. This is really strange, I thought. I was certain that the footsteps, the laughter, and the talk had been real, but apparently I had only been dreaming. I returned to bed and mulled over the way we can deceive ourselves after all, and what might have been the cause of such a strange dream. In the midst of this, I fell asleep again, and at once the same dream began. Once more I heard footsteps, talk, laughter, music. At the same time I had a visual image of several hundred dark-clad figures, possibly peasant boys in their Sunday clothes, who had come down from the mountains and were pouring in around the tower, on both sides with a great deal of loud trampling, laughing, and singing, and playing of accordions. Irritably I thought, this is really the limit. I thought it was a dream, and now it turns out to be reality. At this point I woke up. Once again I jumped up, opened the window and shutters, and found everything just the same as it was before. A deathly still, moonlit night. And then I thought, why, this is simply a case of haunting. Naturally, I asked myself what it meant when a dream was so insistent on its reality at the same time as my being awake. Usually we experience that only when we see a ghost. Being awake means perceiving reality. The dream, therefore, represents a situation equivalent to reality, in which it created a kind of waking state. In this sort of dream, as opposed to ordinary dreams, the unconscious seems bent on conveying a powerful impression of reality to the dreamer, an impression which is emphasized by repetition. The sources of such realities are known to be physical sensations on the one hand and archetypal figures on the other. That night everything was so completely real, or at least seemed to be so, that I could scarcely sort out the two realities, nor could I make anything of the dream itself. What was the meaning of these music-making peasant boys passing by in a long procession? It seemed to me that they had come out of curiosity in order to look at the tower. Never again did I experience or dream anything similar, and I cannot recall ever I cannot recall ever having heard of a parallel to it. It was only much later that I found an explanation. This was when I came across the 17th century Lucerne Chronicle by Renward Kaisat. He tells the following story. On a high pasture of Mount Pilatus, which is particularly notorious for its spooks, it is said that Wotan to this day practices his magic arts there. Kaisat, Cysit, while climbing the mountains, was disturbed one night by a procession of men who poured past his hut, on both sides playing music and singing, precisely what I had experienced in the tower. The next morning, Kaisat asked the herdsman with whom he had spent the night what could have been the meaning of it. The man had a ready explanation. Those must be the departed folk, salig Leut in Swiss dialect. The phrase also means blessed folks, namely Wotan's army of departed souls. These, he said, were in the habit of walking abroad and showing themselves. It may be suggested that this is a phenomenon of solitude, the outward emptiness and silence being compensated by the image of a crowd of people. This would put it in the same class with the hallucinations of hermits, which are likewise compensatory. But do we know what realities such stories may be founded on? It is also possible that I had been so sensitized by the solitude that I had been able to perceive the procession of the departed folk who passed by. The explanation of this experience as a psychic compensation never entirely satisfied me, and to say that it was a hallucination seemed to me to beg the question. I felt obliged to consider the possibility of its reality, especially in view of the 17th century account which had come my way. It would seem most likely to have a synchronistic phenomenon. Such phenomenon just demonstrate that premonitions or visions very often have some correspondence in external reality. There actually existed, as I discovered, a real parallel to my experience. In the Middle Ages, just such gatherings of young men took place. These were the Reichsläufer mercenaries, who usually assembled in spring, marched from central Switzerland to Locarno, met at the Casa di Ferro in Minusio, and then marched on together to Milan. In Italy they served as soldiers fighting for foreign princes. My vision therefore might have been one of these gatherings, which took place regularly each spring when the young men, with singing and jollity, bade farewell to their native land. When we began to build at Bollingen in 1923, my eldest daughter came to see the spot and exclaimed, "What? You're building there? There are corpses about." Naturally, I thought, ridiculous, nothing of the sort. But when we were constructing the annex 4 years later, we did come upon a skeleton. It lay at a depth of 7 feet in the ground. An old rifle butt was embedded in the elbow. From various indications it seemed evident that the body had been thrown into the grave in an advanced state of decay. It belonged to one of many dozens of French soldiers who were drowned in the Linth in 1799 and were later washed up on the shores of the upper lake. These men were drowned when the Austrians blew up a bridge of Gorinau, which the French were storming. A photograph of the open grave with the skeleton, the date of the discovery, August 22, 1927, is preserved at the tower. I arranged a regular burial on my property and fired a gun 3 times over the soldier's grave. Then I set up a gravestone with an inscription for him. My daughter had sensed the presence of the dead body. Her power to sense such things is something she inherits from my grandmother on my mother's side. In the winter of 1955-56, I chiseled the name of my paternal ancestors on 3 stone tablets and placed them in the courtyard of the tower. I painted the ceiling with motifs of my own and my wife's arms, and from those my son-in-law. The Young family originally had a phoenix for its arms, the bird obviously being connected with young and youth and rejuvenation. My grandfather changed the elements of the arms, probably out of a spirit of resistance towards his father. He was an ardent Freemason and a Grand Master of the Swiss Lodge. This has a good deal to do with the changes he made in the armorial bearings. I mention this point in itself of no consequence, because it belongs to the historical nexus of my thinking and my life. In keeping with this revision of my grandfather's, my coat of arms no longer contains the original phoenix. Instead, there is a cross azure in chief dexter, and in base sinister a blue bunch of grapes in the field of d'or. Separating these is an étoile d'or in a fesse azure. Translated from the language of heraldry, a blue cross in the upper right, and blue grapes in the lower left, in a field of gold, and a blue bar with a gold star. End of footnote. The symbolism of these arms is Masonic, or Rosicru opposites, per crucem ad rosum, that is, the Christian and Dionysian elements, so cross and grapes are symbols of the heavenly and the Catharonic spirit. The uniting symbol is the gold star, or aurum philosophorum. The Rosicrucians derived from Hermetic or alchemical philosophy. One of their founders was Michael Meyer, 1568 to 1622, a well-known alchemist and younger contemporary of the relatively unknown but more important Gerardus Dorneus, end of 16th century, whose treatises fill the first volume of the Theatrum Chemicum of 1602. These 2 men lived in Frankfurt, which seems to have been a center of alchemical philosophy at the time. In any case, the Count Palatin and court physician to Rudolf II, Michael Meyer, was something of a local celebrity. In neighboring Mainz at the time there lived Dr. Med. et Jur. Carl Jung, died 1654, of whom nothing else is known, since the family tree breaks off with my great-great-grandfather, who lived at the beginning of the 18th century. This was Sigmund Freud, a civis mogatinus citizen of Mainz. This hiatus is due to the fact that the municipal archives of Mainz were burned in the course of a siege during the War of the Spanish Succession. It is a safe surmise that this evidently learned Dr. Carl Jung was familiar with the writings of the 2 alchemists, for the pharmacology of the day was very much under the influence of Paracletus. Dornius was an outspoken Paraclecist, and even composed a voluminous commentary on the Paraclesan treatise De Vita Longa. He also, more than all the other alchemists, dealt with the process of individuation. In view of the fact that a large part of my life work has revolved around the study of the problem of opposites, and especially their alchemical symbolism, all this is not without a certain interest. When I was working on the stone tablets, I became aware of the fateful link between me and my ancestors. I felt very strongly that which I am under the influence of things or questions which were left incomplete and unanswered by my parents and grandparents and more distant ancestors. It often seems as if there were an impersonal karma within a family which is passed on from parent to children. Has always seemed to me that I had to answer questions which fate had poised to my forefathers, and which had not yet been answered, or as if I had to complete or perhaps continue things which previous ages had left unfinished. It is difficult to determine whether these questions are more of a personal or more of a general collective nature. It seems to me that the latter is the case. A collective problem, if not recognized as such, always appears as a personal problem, and in individual cases may give the impression that something is out of order in the realm of the personal psyche. The personal sphere is indeed disturbed, but such disturbances need not be primary, they may be well secondary, the consequence of an insupportable change in the social atmosphere. The cause of disturbance is, therefore, not to be sought in the personal surroundings, but rather in the collective situation. Psychotherapy has hitherto taken this matter far too little into account. Like anyone who is capable of some introspection, I had early taken it for granted that the split in my personality was my own purely personal affair and responsibility. Faust, to be sure, had made the problem somewhat easier for me by confessing 2 souls, alas, are housed within my breast, but he had thrown no light on the cause of this dichotomy. His insight seemed, in a sense, directed straight at me. In the days in which I first read Faust, I could not remotely guess the extent to which Goethe's strange heroic myth was a collective experience, and that prophetically anticipated the fate of the Germans. Therefore I felt personally implicated, and when Faust, in his hubris and self-inflation, caused the murder of Philemon and Baucis, I felt guilty, quite as if I myself in the past had helped commit the murder of the 2 old people. The strange idea alarmed me, and I regarded it as my responsibility to atone for this crime, or to prevent its repetition. My false conclusion was further supported by a bit of odd information that I picked up during those early years. I heard that it had been bruited about that my grandfather Young had been an illegitimate son of Goethe. And then it says, see above, chapter 2 and 1, page 35 to 36. So we talked about that in chapter 2, or we heard about it. This annoying story made an impression upon me insofar as if once corroborated and This annoying story made an impression upon me insofar as it at once corroborated and seemed to explain my curious reaction to Faust. It is true that I did not believe in reincarnation, but I am instinctively familiar with the concept which the Indians call karma. Since in those days I had no idea of the existence of the unconscious, I could not have had a psychological understanding of my own reactions. I also did not know, no more than then, even today, it is generally known that the future is unconsciously prepared long in advance and therefore can be guessed by clairvoyance. Thus, when the news arrived of the crowning of Kaiser Wilhelm I at Versailles, Jacob Burckhardt exclaimed, quote, "This is the doom of Germany," unquote. The archetypes of Wagner was already knocking at the gates, and although with them came the Dionysian experience of Nietzsche, which might better be ascribed to the god of ecstasy, Wotan. Although that happened. The hubris of the will of the the hubris of the Wilhelmine era alienated Europe and paved the way for the disaster of 1914. Reader's note. Um, there's a lot that one could unpack in that statement. And a reader's note. In my youth, around 1890, I was unconsciously caught up by the spirit of the age, and had no methods at hand for extricating myself from it. Faust struck a chord in me and pierced me myself from it. Oh, sorry. Faust struck a chord in me and pierced me through in a way I could not but regard as personal. Most of all, it awakened in me the problem of opposites, of good and evil, of mind and matter, of light and darkness. Faust, the inept, purblind philosopher, encounters the dark side of his being, his sinister shadow, Mephistopheles, who, in spite of his negating disposition, represents the true spirit of life as against the arid scholar, who hovers on the brink of suicide. My own inner contradiction appeared here in dramatized form. Goethe had written virtually a basic outline and pattern of my own conflicts and solutions. The dichotomy of Faust, Mephistopheles came together within myself into a single person, and I was that person. In other words, I was directly struck, and recognized that this was my fate. Hence all the crisis of the drama affected me personally. At one point I had passionately to agree and another to oppose. No solution could be a matter of indifference to me. Later I consciously linked my work to what Faust had passed over: respect for the eternal rights of man, recognition of the ancient, and continuity of the culture and intellectual history. Footnote. Young's attitude is shown in the inscription he placed over the gate of the tower. Philemonius Sacram Fausti Poenitentia. Shrine of Philemon, repentance of Faust. When the gate was walled up, he put the same words above the entrance onto the second tower. End of footnote. Our souls, as well as our bodies, are composed of individual elements which were all already present in the ranks of our ancestors. This, quote, newness in the individual psyche is an endlessly varied recombination of age-old components. Body and soul, therefore, have an intensely historical character, and find no proper place in what is new in things that have just come into being. That is to say, our ancestral components are only partly at home in such things. We are very far from having finished completely with the Middle Ages, classical antiquity, and primitivity as our modern psyche pretends. Nevertheless, we have plunged down the cataract of progress, which sweeps us on into the future with ever wider violence the further it takes us from our roots. Once the past has been breached, it is usually annihilated, and there is no stopping the forward motion. But it is precisely the loss of connection with the past, our uprootedness, which has given rise to the discontents of civilization, and to such a flurry and haste that we live more in the future and its chimerial promises of a golden age than in the present, with which our whole evolutionary background has not yet caught up. We rush impetuously into novelty, driven by mounting sense of insufficiency, dissatisfaction, and restlessness. We no longer live on what we have, but on promises, no longer in the light of the present day, but in the darkness of the future, which we expect will at last bring the proper sunrise. We refuse to recognize that everything is better is purchased at the price of something worse, that, for example, the host's hope of greater freedom is cancelled out by the increased enslavement to the state, not to speak of the terrible perils to which the most brilliant discoveries of science expose us. The less we understand of what our fathers and forefathers sought, the less we understand ourselves, and thus we help with all our might to rob the individual of her roots and her guiding instincts, so that she becomes a particle in the mass, ruled only by what Nietzsche called the spirit of gravity. Reforms by advances, that is, by new methods or gadgets, are of course impressive at first, but in the long run they are dubious and in any case dearly paid for. They by no means increase the contentment or happiness of people on the whole. Mostly they are deceptive sweetenings of existence, the speedier communications which unpleasantly accelerate the tempo of life and leave us with less time than ever before. Omnis festinatio ex parte diaboli est, all haste is of the devil, and as the old masters used to say. Reforms by retrogressions, on the other hand, are as a rule less expensive and in addition more lasting, for they return to the simpler, tried, and tested ways of the past, and make the sparsest use of newspapers, radio, television, and all supposedly time-saving innovations. In this book, I have devoted considerable space to my subjective view of the world, which, however, is not a product of rational thinking. It is rather a vision, such as will come to one who undertakes deliberately, with half-closed eyes and somewhat closed ears, to see and hear the form and voices of being. In our impressions, if our impressions are too distinct, we are held to the hour and minute of the present, and have no way of knowing how our ancestral psyches listen to and understand the present. In other words, how our unconscious is responding to him. In other words, how our unconscious is responding to it. Thus, we remain ignorant of whether our ancestral components find an elementary gratification in our lives, and whether they are repelled. Inner peace and contentment depend in large measure upon whether or not the historical family, which is inherent in the individual, can be harmonized with the ephemeral conditions of the present. In the tower at Bowlingen, it is as if one lived in many centuries simultaneously. The place will outlive me, and in its location and style it points backwards to things of long ago. There is very little about it to suggest the present. If a man of the 16th century were to move into the house, only the kerosene lamp and the matches would be new to him. Otherwise, he would know his way around without difficulty. There is nothing to disturb the dead, neither electric lights nor the telephone. Moreover, my ancestors' souls are sustained by the atmosphere of the house, since I answer for them the question that their lives once left behind. I carve out rough answers as best I can. I have even drawn them on the walls. It is as if a silent greater family, stretching down the centuries, were peopling the house. There I live in my second personality and see life in the round as something forever coming into being and passing on. Commentary. Well, first and foremost, I think the idea of having a house, like building your own house, is very much about individuation. So we have, uh, we have terms like home is a man or a woman's castle, and that kind of thing. But we also know that oftentimes the house in dreams represents the self. So how wonderful it was that he was able to build his own self, a very visceral, physical representation in realization of the self. But that doesn't mean that we don't all get that chance in some way. So really making home, I think, is really important. So I personally had a situation that happened to me in my um, early 40s where I wasn't at home. I ended up not really being at home for about 10 years, and then finally in the last year have found home again. And it feels so very different having a real home and being able to build that. So my partner and I have been um, building that physically, actually literally building that. So I think that there's this really basic piece to this that is very simple, and it's not elegant at all. It's just that piece that in order to really fully individuate, you have to have home. You have to, and that there's a part of that home that you build, and that in that building there is an unfolding that is really beautiful, especially if one can be present to that, and that piece of being mindful, or being aware of your dreams, however you want to say it, when you're creating your home, I think can be incredibly liberating and instructive. So whether you practice mindfulness or take the time to be aware of your dreams and sort of process your dreams and your thoughts and daydreams as they come when you're building your home. I think that that's instructive and incredibly powerful. I wanted to speak to this sentence. A collective problem, if not recognized as such, always appears as a personal problem, and individual cases may give the impression that something is out of the order in the realm of the personal psyche. So I think that that's one of the tricks of being human, is that the collective and the personal aren't really separated and are separated at the same time. So like Ken Wilber talks about, the whole on, which I'm not really fond of making up language types of things, but just this idea that um, that we are one. We are the collective and we are the individual. We're personally responsible for ourselves, and we carry the collective within us. And I think that speaks also to issues around um, societal or national shadow, um, and to being able to really look at that and just accepting that things can be something and not something at the same time. They can be individual and collective at the same time, and to be able to look at that, I think, is very humanizing, and it's also very hard. So right now in the country where I live, there's a kind of a shift. It's called like a populist shift. It's very interesting. It's called a populist shift in the leadership of this country. And for many people, it feels very, very much like shadow work is happening. For me, I've been really trying to look at this as like how is that leader and that darkness that's happening, how is that me? And really looking at that, which doesn't mean that I'm not responsible for my own shadow, and it doesn't mean that I'm not responsible to take the action that I feel needs to be taken in opposition or in alternatives, I'd say, rather than opposition, but in alternative ways of being um, with other people to um, not create more of a divide in the country that I live in. So last I wanted to say something about the ghosts or the spirits or the dead. And he talks about his ability to have these experiences because of the tower. And what my feeling is that this connection with past memories, are ancestral or archetypal or um, memories of being part of human species or being part of the planet or the universe. I think that those are there, and what we do is we teach ourselves not to pay attention to them. And I think that once we can get in a space where it's safe, and then we develop the language for them, which is difficult because we don't have that kind of language. You sound like you're crazy when you talk about seeing ghosts. People are like, yeah, right. But once we have that language, that I think that kind of knowledge and experience is accessible to everybody. But it requires to have a language that's safe to communicate in that way, and also because we don't have pathways for having those experiences and then kind of coming back from those experiences, except we would call it like a psychic break or something like that. Then we've like cut ourselves off from that part of who we are, which is really too bad. But I don't think that what the experience that Jung is talking about with the people um, coming around him and experiencing that, I don't think that that's actually uncommon. I think that we actually, a lot of us have those experiences really kind of frequently, but we block them out because it's too scary in this culture. We've agreed that those realities don't exist, but of course they exist. And sometimes, once in a while, you find somebody that you can actually talk about those kinds of experiences with, and it's incredibly liberating. So, if you listened this far, thank you so much.